Hello, welcome. Let us get this up on my thingo. Okay. All right, here we are for another weekly reading stream. Once again, like usual, COVID-19, the Great Reset. So we're up to 1.4.2 global governance. Now there is going to be I think I'd started the section on the geopolitical reset last time. And um, I will probably end up going through the rest of this section if I can. First, I am going to roll a cigarette. Roll a cigarette. Before the stream, I just started reading the first book of Enoch. um, so I'm sure that'll be interesting to go through. For anyone who doesn't know, it's basically like a fan fiction of the book of Genesis set before the flood. Um, Enoch is like the supposedly the great grandfather of Noah of Noah's Ark fame. Um, that thing that didn't happen, but yeah, I just started reading that. So that's probably the first time I've read like an apocryphal text. So there's definitely a lot of stuff to read later. I have a English translation of all the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Have have an English translation of the Nag Hammadi scriptures, which includes the Gospel of Judas, which wasn't found at Nag Hammadi, but sort of lumped in there because the Nag Hammadi discovery is where a lot of the Gnostic Gospels were found. So, Gospel of Judas being a Gnostic Gospel, they just kind of chucked it in there for good measure. Um, But yeah, here we go. COVID-19, the Great Reset. Continuing chapter 1. Global governance. Oh, sorry, I will be back. I just had to deal with something. Um, start that didn't really. Global governance is commonly defined as the process of cooperation among transnational actors aimed at providing responses to global problems, those that affect more than one state or region. It encompasses the totality of institutions, policies, norms, procedures, and initiatives through which nation states try to bring more predictability and stability to their responses to transnational challenges. This definition makes it clear that any global effort on any global issue or concern is bound to be toothless without the cooperation of national governments and their ability to act and legislate to support their aims. Nation states make global governance possible, one leads to the other, which is why the UN says that effective global governance can only be achieved with effective international cooperation. The two notions of global governance and international cooperation are so intertwined that it is nigh on impossible for global governance to flourish in a divided world that is retrenching and fragmenting. The more nationalism and isolationism pervade the global polity, the greater the chance that global governance loses its relevance and becomes ineffective. Sadly, we are now at this critical juncture. Put bluntly, we live in a world in which nobody is really in charge. COVID-19 has reminded us that the biggest problems we face are global in nature. Whether it's pandemics, climate change, terrorism, or international trade, all are global issues that we can only address and whose risks can only be mitigated in a collective fashion. But the world has become, in the words of Ian Bremmer, a G0 world, or worse, a G-2 world, the US and China. According to the Indian economist Arvind Subramanian, to account for the absence of leadership of the two giants by opposition to the G7, the group of seven wealthiest nations, or the G20, the G7 plus 13 other significant countries and organizations, which are supposed to lead. More and more often, the big problems besetting us take place beyond the control of even the most powerful nation states. The risks and issues to be confronted are increasingly globalized, interdependent, and interconnected, while the global governance capacities to do so are failing perilously, endangered by the resurgence of nationalism. Such disconnect signifies not only that the most critical global issues are being addressed in a highly fragmented, thus inadequate manner, but also that they are actually being exacerbated by this failure to deal with them properly. Thus, far from remaining constant in terms of the risk they pose, they inflate and end up increasing systemic fragility. This is shown in Figure 1 presented on page 25. Strong interconnections exist between global governance failure, climate action failure, national government failure, with which it has a self-reinforcing effect, social instability, and of course the ability to successfully deal with pandemics. In a nutshell, Global governance is at the nexus of all these other issues. Therefore, the concern is that without appropriate global governance, we will become paralyzed in our attempts to address and respond to global challenges, particularly when there is such a strong dissonance between short-term domestic imperatives and long-term global challenges. This is a major worry, considering that today there is no committee to save the world. The expression was used more than 20 years ago at the height of the Asian financial crisis. Pursuing the argument further, one could even claim that the general institutional decay that Fukuyama describes in Political Order and Political Decay amplifies the problem of a world devoid of global governance. It sets in motion a vicious cycle in which nation-states deal poorly with the major challenges that beset them, which then feeds into the public's distrust of the state, which in turn leads to the states being starved of authority and resources, then leading to even poorer performance and the inability or unwillingness to deal with issues of global governance. COVID-19 tells just such a story of failed global governance. From the very beginning, a vacuum in global governance, exacerbated by the strained relations between the US and China, undermined international efforts to respond to the pandemic. At the onset of the crisis, international cooperation was non-existent or limited, and even during the period when it was needed the most, in the acme of the crisis during the second quarter of 2020, it remained conspicuous by its absence. Instead of triggering a set of measures coordinated globally, COVID-19 led to the opposite. A stream of border closures, restrictions in international travel and trade, introduced almost without any coordination, the frequent interruption of medical supply distribution, and the ensuing competition for resources, particularly visible in various attempts by several nation-states to source badly needed medical equipment by any means possible. Even in the EU, countries initially chose to go it alone, but that course of action subsequently changed, with practical assistance between member countries, an amended EU budget in support of healthcare systems, and pooled research funds to develop treatments and vaccines. And there have now been ambitious measures which would have seemed unimaginable in the pre-pandemic era, susceptible of pushing the EU towards further integration. In particular, a €750 billion recovery fund put forward by the European Commission. In a functioning global governance framework, nations should have come together to fight a global and coordinated war against the pandemic. Instead, the "my country first" response prevailed in severely impaired attempts to contain the expansion of the first wave of the pandemic. It also placed constraints on the availability of protective equipment and treatment that in turn undermined the resilience of national healthcare systems. Furthermore, this fragmented approach went on to jeopardize attempts to coordinate exit policies aimed at restarting the global economic engine. In the case of the pandemic, in contrast with other recent global crises like 9/11 or the financial crisis of 2008, the global governance system failed, proving either non-existent or dysfunctional. The US went on to withdraw funding from the World Health Organization, but no matter the underlying rationale of this decision, the fact remains that it is the only organization capable of coordinating a global response to the pandemic. which means that an albeit far from perfect World Health Organization is infinitely preferable to a non-existent one, an argument that Bill Gates compellingly and succinctly made in a tweet. Their work is slowing the spread of COVID-19, and if that work is stopped, no other organization can replace them. The world needs WHO now more than ever. This failure is not the WHO's fault. The UN agency is merely the symptom, not the cause, of global governance failure. The WHO's deferential posture towards donor countries reflects its complete dependence on states agreeing to cooperate with it. The UN organization has no power to compel information sharing or enforce pandemic preparedness. Like other similar UN agencies, for example, on human rights or climate change, the WHO is saddled with limited and dwindling resources. In 2018, it had an annual budget of $4.2 million, minuscule in comparison to any health budget around the world. In addition, it is at the perpetual mercy of member states and has effectively no tools at its disposal to directly monitor outbreaks, coordinate pandemic planning, or ensure effective preparedness implementation at the country level, let alone allocate resources to those countries most in need. This dysfunctionality is symptomatic of a broken global governance system, and the jury is out as to whether existing global governance configurations like the UN and the WHO can be repurposed to address today's global risks. For the time being, the bottom line is this. In the face of such a vacuum in global governance, only nation states are cohesive enough to be capable of taking collective decisions, but this model doesn't work in the case of world risks that require concerted global decisions. The world will be a very dangerous place if we do not fix multilateral institutions. Global coordination will be even more necessary in the aftermath of the epidemiological crisis, for it is inconceivable that the global economy could restart without sustained international cooperation. Without it, we'll be heading towards a poorer, meaner, and smaller world. The growing rivalry between China and the US. In the post-pandemic era, COVID-19 might be remembered as the turning point that ushered in a new type of Cold War between China and the US. The two words new type matter considerably. Unlike the Soviet Union, China is not seeking to impose its ideology around the world. Prior to the pandemic, tensions between the two dominant powers were already building up in many different domains. Trade, property rights, military bases in the South China Sea, and tech and investment in strategic industries in particular. But after 40 years of strategic engagement, the US and China now seem unable to bridge the ideological and political divides that separate them. Far from uniting the two geopolitical giants, the pandemic did the exact opposite by exacerbating their rivalry and intensifying competition between them. Most analysts would concur that, during the COVID-19 crisis, the political and ideological fracture between the two giants grew. According to Wang Jingxi, a renowned Chinese scholar and dean at the School of International Studies at Peking University, the fallout from the pandemic has pushed China-US relations to their worst levels since 1979, when formal ties were established. In his opinion, the bilateral economic and technological decoupling is already irreversible, and it could go as far as the global system breaking into two parts, warns Wang Huiyao, president of the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing. Even public figures have expressed publicly their concern. In an article published in June 2020, Lee Hsien Loong, Prime Minister of Singapore, warned against the perils of confrontation between the US and China, which, in his own words, raises profound questions about Asia's future and the shape of the emerging international order. He added that Southeast Asian countries, including Singapore, are especially concerned, as they live at the intersection of the interests of various major powers and must avoid being caught in the middle or forced into invidious choices. Views, of course, differ radically on which country is right or going to come out on top by benefiting from the perceived weaknesses or fragilities of the other. But it is essential to contextualize them. There isn't a right view and a wrong view, but different and often diverging interpretations that frequently correlate with the origin, culture, and personal history of those who profess them. Pursuing further the quantum world metaphor mentioned earlier, it could be inferred from quantum physics that objective reality does not exist. We think that observation and measurement define an objective opinion, but the micro world of atoms and particles, like the macro world of geopolitics, is governed by the strange rules of quantum mechanics, in which two different observers are entitled to their own opinions. This is called a superposition. Particles can be in several places or states at once. Why the fuck is he randomly bringing up quantum physics while talking about geopolitics? That in the world of international affairs, two different observers are entitled to their own opinions. That makes them subjective, but no less real and no less valid. If an observer can only make sense of the reality through different idiosyncratic lenses, this forces us to rethink our notion of objectivity. It is evident that the representation of reality depends on the position of the observer. In that case, a Chinese view and a US view can coexist, together with multiple other views along a continuum, all of them real. To a considerable extent, and for understandable reasons, the Chinese view of the world and its place in it is influenced by the humiliation suffered during the First Opium War in 1840 and the subsequent invasion in 1900, when the Eight-Nation Alliance looted Beijing and other Chinese cities before demanding compensation. Conversely, how the US views the world and its place in it is largely based on the values and principles that have shaped American public life since the country's founding. These have determined both its preeminent world position and its unique attractiveness for many immigrants for 250 years. The US perspective is also rooted in the unrivaled dominance it has enjoyed over the rest of the world for the past few decades, and the inevitable doubts and insecurities that come with a relative loss of absolute supremacy. For understandable reasons, both China and the US have a rich history. China's goes back 5,000 years, of which they are proud, leading them, as Kishore Mahbubani observed, to overestimate their own strengths and underestimate the strengths of the other. Vindicating the point above, all analysts and forecasters who specialize in China, the US, or both have access to more or less the same data and information, now a global commodity. See, hear, and read more or less the same things, but sometimes reach diametrically opposed conclusions. Some see the US as the ultimate winner, others argue that China has already won, and a third group states that there will be no winners. Let's briefly review each of their arguments in turn. This will be interesting. China as a winner. The argument of those who claim that the pandemic crisis has benefited China while exposing the weaknesses of the US is threefold. 1. It has made the American strength as the world's most prominent military power irrelevant in the face of an invisible and microscopic enemy. 2. In the words of the American academic who coined the expression, it hurt the US soft power because of the incompetence of its response. An important caveat, the issue of whether a public response to COVID-19 was competent or incompetent has given rise to a myriad of opinions and provoked much disagreement. Yet it remains difficult to pass judgment. In the US, for example, the policy response was to a large extent the responsibility of states and even cities. Hence, in effect, there was no national US policy response as such. What we are discussing here are subjective opinions that shape public attitudes. 3. It has exposed aspects of American society that some may find shocking, like the deep inequalities in the face of the outbreak, the lack of universal medical coverage, and the issue of systemic racism raised by the Black Lives Matter movement. All these prompted Kishore Mahbubani, an influential analyst of the rivalry that opposes the US and China, to argue that COVID-19 has reversed the roles of both countries in terms of dealing with disasters and supporting others. While in the past, the US was always the first to arrive with aid where assistance was needed, like on 26th of December 2004 when a major tsunami hit Indonesia, this role now belongs to China, he says. In March 2020, China sent to Italy 31 tons of medical equipment, ventilators, masks, and protective suits that the EU could not provide. In his opinion, the 6 billion people who compose the rest of the world and live in 191 countries have already begun prepping themselves for the US-China geopolitical contest. Mahbubani says that it is their choices that will determine who wins the rivalry contest, and that these will be based on the cold calculus of reason to work out cost-benefit analyses of what both the US and China have to offer them. Sentiments may not play much of a role because all these countries will base their choice on which, the US or China, will at the end of the day improve their citizens' living conditions. But a vast majority of them do not want to be caught in a geopolitical zero-sum game and would prefer to keep all their options open, i.e., not to be forced to choose between the US and China. However, as the example of Huawei has shown, even traditional US allies like France, Germany, and the UK are being pressured by the US to do so. The decisions that countries make when facing such a stark choice will ultimately determine who emerges as the winner in the growing rivalry between the US and China. The US as a winner. In the camp of America as the ultimate winner, arguments are centered on the inherent strengths of the US as well as the perceived structural weaknesses of China. The US as a winner proponents think it is premature to call for an abrupt end of US supremacy in the post-pandemic era, and offer the following argument. The country may be declining in relative terms, but it is still a formidable hegemon in absolute terms and continues to possess a considerable amount of soft power. Its appeal as a global destination may be waning somehow, but it nonetheless remains strong, as shown by the success of American universities abroad and the appeal of its cultural industry. In addition, the dollar's domination as a global currency used in trade and perceived as a safe haven remains largely unchallenged for the moment. This translates into considerable geopolitical power, enabling the US authorities to exclude companies and even countries like Iran or Venezuela from the dollar system. As we saw in the preceding chapter, this may change in the future, but over the next few years, there is no alternative to the world's dominance of the US dollar. More fundamentally, proponents of US irreducibility will argue, with Ruchir Sharma, that US economic supremacy has repeatedly proved declinists wrong. They will also agree with Winston Churchill, who once observed that the US has an innate capability to learn from its mistakes, when he remarked that the US always did the right thing when all the alternatives have been exhausted. Churchill. Leaving aside the highly charged political argument, democracy versus autocracy, those who believe that the US will remain a winner for many more years also stress that China faces its own headwinds on its path to global superpower status. Those most frequently mentioned are the following. 1. It suffers from a demographic disadvantage with a fast aging population and a working age population that peaked in 2015. 2. Its influence in Asia is constrained by existing territorial disputes with Brunei, Indonesia, India, Japan, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. And 3, it is highly energy dependent. Probably not for much longer. I mean, I think the idea that the US is really going to come out and back this, I think at this point it's nonsensical. Now, I'm not a China defense, but I can acknowledge that like the geopolitical order is changing. We can just hope, you know, America's like Trump's re-election has basically been yet another nail in the coffin. No winner. What do those who claim that the pandemic bodes ill for both American and Chinese power and for the global order think? They argue that, like almost all other countries around the world, both China and the US are certain to suffer massive economic damage that will limit their capacity to extend their reach and influence. China, whose trade sector represents more than a third of total GDP, will find it difficult to launch a sustained economic recovery when its large trading partners, like the US, are drastically retrenching. As for the US, its over-indebtedness will sooner or later constrain post-recovery spending, with the ever-present risk that the current economic crisis metastasizes into a systemic financial crisis. Referring in the case of both countries to the economic hit and domestic political difficulties, the Downers assert that both countries are likely to emerge from this crisis significantly diminished. Neither a new Pax Sinica nor a renewed Pax Americana will rise from the ruins. Rather, both powers will be weakened at home and abroad. Sure. An underlying reason for the no-winner argument is an intriguing idea put forward by several academics, most notably Niall Ferguson. Essentially, it says that the corona crisis has exposed the failure of superpowers like the US and China by highlighting the success of small states. In the words of Ferguson, the real lesson here is not that the US is finished and China is going to be the dominant power of the 21st century. I think the reality is that all the superpowers, the United States, the People's Republic of China, and the European Union, have been exposed as highly dysfunctional. Being big, as the proponents of this idea argue, entails diseconomies of scale. Countries or empires have grown so large as to reach a threshold beyond which they cannot effectively govern themselves. This, in turn, is the reason why small economies like Singapore, Iceland, South Korea, and is not real, seem to have done better than the US in containing the pandemic and dealing with it. Yes, it says it's real. I'm saying it's not real. Predicting is a guessing game for fools. The simple truth is that nobody can tell with any degree of reasonable confidence or certainty how the rivalry between the US and China will evolve, apart from saying that it will inevitably grow. The pandemic has exacerbated the rivalry that opposes the incumbent and the emerging power. The US has stumbled in the pandemic crisis and its influence has waned. Meanwhile, China may be trying to benefit from the crisis by expanding its reach abroad. We know very little about what the future holds in terms of strategic competition between China and the US. It will oscillate between two extremes: contained and manageable deterioration tempered by business interests at one end of the spectrum to permanent and all-out hostility at the other. Let me roll another cigarette before I continue with the So, I think in some respect it's difficult to say. I mean, I don't think that the US is going to be on the decline. Whether China takes over is likely, but not guaranteed. Um, so I think maybe Australia should sort itself out and maybe we can become sick. um, although we could be. Like I want to make that clear enough. Like with the right economic management, we have the endowment that we could become like an economic superpower. Um, the question of like a military superpower, I don't think I would want that. Um, simply due to the fact that we don't need more war. But in terms of like an economic superpower, definitely, we definitely could do that. So, like, we have a very large endowment. Like, I actually just looked into this today, and in terms of like climate stuff and like sort of energy transition, we could we literally have like the resources in the country, not even with any exports. We have all the resources to replace our entire baseload energy system with thorium nuclear. I don't like uranium for the record, but thorium nuclear, and completely get rid of fossil fuels within like less than 20 years. And even just going off current energy usage, there is enough thorium in Australia to power the country for over 40,000 years. That is insane. That is insane. And, that's like apparently Australia's got like one of the highest thorium endowments in the world. So yes, we could very easily like completely get away from fossil fuels as a source of baseload power within like less than 20 years. Now that does not answer the question of like transport. That only really addresses the question um, of like baseload energy, and then of course I support more solar on buildings, more solar on dwellings. Uh, Solar farms, yeah, wind farms, yeah. I support more um solar on dwellings and more and thorium for baseload. In terms of transport, I think that hydrogen is the way to go versus EVs. I actually should look up whether we would have like the materials here to like create our own like hydrogen vehicles. That would be interesting. So, you know what I mean too? Like not just like hydrogen cars, but like hydrogen trucks. Like let's try, hydrogen trucks. Like, and like people might complain about like, oh, the cost. Like we don't want to pay more taxes. And it's like, well, I think we have bigger problems than higher taxes with regards to doing that. There are much more significant barriers than cost. Um, Now, granted, like when I was looking this up, I intentionally excluded the cost. Uh, So I essentially presupposed a communist society, a classless, stateless, moneyless society that was like just confined to this one country, which would not be a great situation to be in because we'd be literally isolated from the rest of the world, like completely. Um, but yeah, uh, yeah, we'll suppose we'll see soon enough. Um, how things go in the future. Once I finish the cigarette, I'll get back to reading. Almost halfway through. We're getting there. Um, yeah. And I mean, in that kind of isolated scenario, I mean, like, the worst problem with like just like an isolated thing in one country, like the biggest concern would not be with resource scarcity, not for Australia. The biggest threat would not be resource scarcity, but rather being put under like a constant global siege. um, which I mean, you know, didn't stop the Bolsheviks. Oh, actually, it did. It did stop the Bolsheviks. um, they ended up reforming interstate capitalism. Unfortunately, oh well. But, and then Stalin happened. Uh, yeah, I mean, in the modern day, like a country like Australia, we could be autarkic if we had to be. Like we could be autarkic if we had to be. Um, in a situation where this kind of scenario happens, where we have like a quote unquote communism in one country scenario, where we're isolated from the rest of the world, but we keep pushing anyway, and like go to like a full like classless, stateless, moneyless society in one country, we could be autarkic. There would be a period of recovery that would be necessary to get to that point, um, which might result in like it's like a short term hit, long term prosperity situation. Like even if we were left alone, it would still take maybe like 30 years to fully get back on our feet. Um, during that time, there would be a modest reduction in standard of living, although that would, in a sense, be offset by like a more egalitarian sort of elevating everyone to a higher sort of. So I guess like all in all, it would probably still be like an increase in standard of living for the general populace, but it would take like 30 years to fix a lot of the immediate problems that might arise from such a scenario. within 30 years, 50 at the very most, a scenario like that would it would as I said, short term hit, long term prosperity. It would take 30, 50 years at the most to reorient and the result would be an Australia more prosperous than anything we're seeing right now. So that's an interesting thought experiment. um, that presupposes we're left alone though, which we wouldn't be. But let's continue. 1.4.4 Fragile and failing states. The boundaries between state fragility, a failing state, and a failed one are fluid and tenuous. In today's complex and adaptive world, the principle of nonlinearity means that suddenly a fragile state can turn into a failed state, and that conversely, a failed state can see its situation improve with equal celerity due to the intermediation of international organizations or even an infusion of foreign capital. In the coming years, as the pandemic inflicts hardship globally, it is most likely that the pandemic will only go one way for the world's poorest and most fragile countries, from bad to worse. In short, many states that exhibit characteristics of fragility risk failing. State fragility remains one of the most critical global challenges, particularly prevalent in Africa. Its causes are multiple and intertwined. They range from social disparity, economic issues, political corruption and inefficiencies, to external and internal conflicts and natural disasters. Today, it is estimated that about 1.8 to 2 billion people lived in fragile states, a number that will certainly increase in the post-pandemic era because fragile countries are particularly vulnerable to an outbreak of COVID-19. The very essence of their fragility, weak state capacity, and the associated inability to ensure the fundamental functions of basic public services and security makes them less able to cope with the virus. The situation is even worse in failing and failed states that are almost always victims of extreme poverty and fractious violence, and as such can barely or no longer perform basic public functions like education, security, or governance. Within their power vacuum, helpless people fall victim to competing factions and crime, often compelling the UN or a neighboring state, not always well-intentioned, to intervene to prevent a humanitarian disaster. For many such states, the pandemic will be the exogenous shock that forces them to fail and fall even further. For all these reasons, it is almost a tautology to state that the damage inflicted by the pandemic to fragile and failing states will be much deeper and longer lasting than in the richer and most developed economies. It will devastate some of the world's most vulnerable communities. In many cases, economic disaster will trigger some form of political instability and outbreaks of violence because the world's poorest countries will suffer from two predicaments. First, the breakdown in trade and supply chains caused by the pandemic will provoke immediate devastation, like no remittances or increased hunger. And second, further down the line, they will endure a prolonged and severe loss of employment and income. This is the reason why the global outbreak has such potential to wreak havoc in the world's poorest countries. It is there that economic decline will have an even more immediate effect on societies. Across large swaths of sub-Saharan Africa in particular, but also in parts of Asia and Latin America, millions depend on a meager daily income to feed their families. Any lockdown or health crisis caused by the coronavirus would rapidly create widespread desperation and disorder, potentially triggering massive unrest with global knock-on effects. The implications will be particularly damaging for all those countries caught in the midst of a conflict. For them, the pandemic will inevitably disrupt humanitarian assistance and aid flows. It will also limit peace operations and postpone diplomatic efforts to bring the conflicts to an end. Geopolitical shocks have a propensity to take observers by surprise, with ripple and knock-on effects that create second, third, and more order consequences. But currently, where are the risks most apparent? All commodity countries are at risk. Norway and a few others do not qualify. Commodity country. We live under capitalism. Every country is a commodity country. I would love to know how he's defining that. At the time of writing, they are being hit particularly hard by the collapse in energy and commodity prices that are exacerbating the problems posed by the pandemic and all the other issues with which they conflate: unemployment, inflation, inadequate health systems, and, of course, poverty. For rich and relatively developed energy-dependent economies like the Russian Federation and Saudi Arabia, the collapse of oil prices only represents a considerable economic blow, putting strained budgets and foreign exchange reserves under strain and posing acute, medium, and long-term risks. But for lower-income countries like South Sudan, where oil accounts for the quasi-totality of exports, the blow could simply be devastating. This is true for many other fragile commodity countries. Okay. So I think I know what he's talking about by commodity countries. I think he's talking about countries with like one or two like really big commodity exports. So I think I get that. Outright collapse is not an outlandish scenario for petrostates like Ecuador or Venezuela, where the virus could overwhelm the country's few functioning hospitals very quickly. Meanwhile, in Iran, US sanctions are compounding the problems associated with the high rate of COVID-19 infection. Particularly at risk now are many countries in the Middle East and Maghreb, where the economic pain was increasingly apparent before the pandemic and with restless, youthful populations and rampant unemployment. The triple blow of COVID-19, the collapse in oil prices for some, and the freeze in tourism, a vital source of employment and foreign currency earnings, could trigger a wave of massive anti-government demonstrations reminiscent of the Arab Spring in 2011. In an ominous sign at the end of April 2020, and in the midst of the lockdown, riots over joblessness concerns and soaring poverty took place in Lebanon. We also saw more protests and more anger at the failure of Arab governments to deal with Israel. The pandemic has brought the issue of food security back with a vengeance, and in many countries it could entail a humanitarian and food crisis catastrophe. Officials from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization predict that the number of people suffering from acute food insecurity could double in 2020 to 265 million. The combination of movement and trade restrictions caused by the pandemic with an increase in unemployment and limited or no access to food, could trigger large-scale social unrest, followed by mass movements of migration and refugees. In fragile and failing states, the pandemic exacerbates existing food shortages through barriers to trade and disruption in global food supply chains. It does so to such a considerable extent that on the 21st of April 2020, David Beasley, Executive Director of the UN World Food Programme, warned the UN Security Council that multiple famines of biblical proportions had become possible in about 3 dozen countries, most notably Yemen, Congo, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Syria, Sudan, Nigeria, and Haiti. In the poorest countries of the world, the lockdowns and the economic recession happening in high-income countries will trigger major income losses for the working poor and all those who depend on them. The decrease in overseas remittances that account for such a large proportion of GDP, more than 30%, in some countries like Nepal, Tonga, or Somalia, is a case in point. It will inflict a devastating shock to their economies with dramatic social implications. According to the World Bank, the impact of lockdowns and the ensuing economic hibernation that happened in so many countries around the world will cause a 20% decline in remittance to low and middle income countries from a $554 billion last year to $445 billion in 2020. In larger countries like Egypt, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and the Philippines, for which remittances are a crucial source of external financing, this will create a lot of hardship and render their economic, social, and political situation even more fragile, with the very real possibility of destabilization. Then there is tourism, one of the hardest hit industries from the pandemic, which is an economic lifeline for many poor nations. In countries like Ethiopia, where tourism revenues account for almost half, 47% of total exports, the corresponding loss of income and employment will inflict considerable economic and social pain. The same goes for the Maldives, Cambodia, and several others. Then there are all the conflict zones where many armed groups are thinking about how to use the excuse of the pandemic to move their agenda forward, like in Afghanistan, where the Taliban is asking that its prisoners be released from jail, or in Somalia, where the Al-Shabaab group presents COVID-19 as an attempt to destabilize them. The global ceasefire plan made on the 23rd of March 2020 by the UN Secretary General, or Global Ceasefire Fleet, has fallen on deaf ears. Of 43 countries with at least 50 reported events of organized violence in 2020, only 10 responded positively, most often with simple statements of support, no commitment to action. Among the other 31 countries with ongoing conflicts, the actors failed not only to take steps to meet the call, but many actually increased the level of organized violence. The early hopes that concerns of the pandemic and the ensuing health emergency might curb long-running conflicts and catalyze peace negotiations have evaporated. This is yet another example of the pandemic not only failing to arrest a troubling or dangerous trend, but in fact accelerating it. Wealthier countries ignore the tragedy unfolding in fragile and failing countries at their peril. In one way or another, risks will reverberate through greater instability or even chaos. One of the most obvious knock-on effects for the richer parts of the world of economic misery discontent, and hunger in the most fragile and poorest states will consist in a new wave of mass migration in its direction, like those that occurred in Europe in 2016. What a great place to finish that off. I'm gonna finish it there. The next bit is like 1.5 environmental reset. I'm gonna just quickly check how long this section is. A while, probably another like 2 weeks maybe. One of the most obvious knock-on effects for the richer parts of the world of economic misery, discontent, and hunger in the most fragile and poor states will consist in a new wave of mass migration in its direction, like those that occurred in Europe in 2016. That's a perfect place to end it. That is a perfect place to end it. I'm working on my speech for the March for Australia in Townsville this Sunday. How convenient timing. That's a great place to end it, guys. That's an ingenious place to end it. Though I've noticed with this book, is it really a manifesto? Like I was expecting, I don't know, I was expecting something a bit more revealing. Like so far, I've just sort of so far it comes off not as a manifesto, but just as like an analysis. Like that's what it comes off as to me. That it's not really like, yeah, I don't know. It's kind of, yeah, I don't know. It feels like it's not really much of a manifesto. Like maybe I'll have to read like some of these book critiques because I'm not seeing much in the way of like. I mean, I'm not really seeing all that much that I'm genuinely concerned about. I mean, like yeah, there's some stuff there about like resurgence of nationalism and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I don't think nationalism is inherently bad, but I can kind of see where it's coming from. Um, it's an interesting. So it's an interesting reality we live in this book. It's like it's more like it's not really doing all that much. I just don't know. Like I don't know. I was just expecting something like that would maybe be a little bit more alarming, but I don't know. That's I'm gonna have to read like some of these like response books about the Great Reset, but I know a lot of it is probably just I don't know. Like for this to just like really come off as like an analysis, I don't know. It does. Like it comes off more as an analysis than a manifesto of any kind. And I mean, it feels like there's a lot that's being predicted there that kind of came true. Now, I mean, some particular tinfoil hat people might say, oh, but that's the intention. He predicted it so they can make it happen. It's like, well, that's a bit silly most of the time. But yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting. It's an interesting question. Hmm. But yeah, in terms of the gaming stream on Thursday, I will be playing. I might start a new game plus in Assassin's Creed Origins if I've got the save files there for it. That's probably what I'll end up doing. I'll maybe I can play through like the from Origins onwards. Um, start with Origins, go straight through into Odyssey, then into I don't know, New Game Plus Valhalla. Um, we go Mirage, and then um, and then Shadows, I guess, but I don't own Shadows yet. Then there was that whole thing, that really strange thing of like Ubisoft releasing like a Saudi Arabia DLC for Assassin's Creed Mirage after they said they were stopping support for it, only for it to turn out that the DLC was funded by the Saudi government. And I'm like, a lot of people like that is strange. Probably a little bit suspicious as well. Some people have theorized like it basically just like propaganda. You said it's just like Saudi state propaganda in the form of a video game DLC. Just fucking bizarre. Um, but I don't know. But yeah, so I will start. I'll just start new game plusing um, Assassin's Creed Origins, and we'll see how that goes. Um, but for now, I'm just gonna finish this off. There really is nothing much to talk about. um, but yeah, so for yeah, I'll see you guys either next Tuesday or on Thursday for the gaming stream. See you later.